You've found the Backup Wrap-Up, your go-to podcast for all things backup, recovery, and cyber recovery. In this episode, we examine one of the most misused terms in our industry, air gap. I'm talking with Preston about what air gap really means, where it came from back in the day, and why it's become so critical again with ransomware attacks. We'll explain the difference between a true air gap and what I would call a virtual air gap or a logical air gap. Trust me, if you've ever wondered whether your backup system is really air gapped, or if you're tired of hearing vendors throw this term around without knowing what they're actually talking about, this is your episode. We're going back to the original definition and explaining why context matters when evaluating modern backup solutions. By the way, if you don't know who I am, I'm W. Curtis Preston, also known as Mr. Backup. And I've been passionate about this topic for over 30 years, ever since I had to tell my boss that there were no backups of the production database that we had just lost. I don't want that to happen to you. I certainly don't want it to happen to me. That's why I do this. On this episode, we will turn unappreciated backup admins into cyber recovery heroes. This is the Backup Wrap-Up. Welcome to the show. Hi, I'm W. Curtis Preston, aka Mr. Backup, and I have with me the one guy that got me to actually start doing my taxes this year, way ahead of schedule. I might actually finish it before April, which will be the first time in, I don't know.
So for our international listeners, who there are quite a few of you out there.
Wait, I haven't introduced you. You're not allowed to talk yet. Prasanna Malaiyandi.
Hi, Curtis. So for our international listeners who may not be aware, in the U.S., we have to submit our taxes or file our taxes by April 15th. That is a typical deadline. You can, of course, ask for an extension and file in October and blah, 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 blah.
But if you owe taxes, you have to pay before the April 15th.
Yeah. So Curtis normally starts first week of April.
Yeah.
And this time he started 5 days before the first week of April.
Well, and in my defense, my taxes are much more complicated than the average person, which you could say, well, that should mean you should start them earlier. But it's like, the procrastination, I don't know if you've ever heard this. Hard work always pays off eventually. Procrastination always pays off immediately.
Yes, it does. But here's the other thing is, I think in the past you've put off doing taxes because, like you said, your taxes are complicated and gathering all the data, I think is like 90% of what everyone struggles with, which is why they procrastinate.
Yeah.
But luckily for you now with with technology, it has now made your life easier, which is why I think you actually started a little earlier.
The technology definitely helped. But I'm at like 85% is where I think I am. I just need to dot the I's and cross the T's, so to speak. The hardest part for me is the going through the thousands of transactions in QuickBooks and making sure that they're all in the right categories, right? And making sure that I include, because I'm not always, the thing I do that's just bad is I'm not always, like, I don't just have one card for business and then always use that card when I'm doing something. Sometimes I'll be somewhere and I don't have that card or whatever, and I'll just
or you
buy
forget
it.
Or whatever else.
Yeah.
So there is a way to solve this, though.
What's that?
Which is what I recommend for a lot of people, which is do it along the way. Don't wait until March 24th to then go through and check your QuickBooks or whatever software thing you're using. Like, if you get a physical receipt, just put it in a box. If you're downloading transactions, just periodically, maybe once a month, spend like 15 minutes while you're drinking coffee, which you're drinking right now, right?
The next thing you're going to tell me is to clean up my shop in between projects instead of waiting until I do 10 projects and then have giant mess and clean that up.
You know what? What you should be doing in your shop, when you use a tool, when you're done with the tool, put it away.
Oh,
Don't wait until
That's just crazy talk. God. God.
See, you were not expecting
handle that
that
level of whatever. Yeah. Anyway, well, speaking of putting away tools, we're going to be talking about putting away backups, putting them away in an area that that you can't get to.
Not getting rid of them.
About air gap. What was that?
Not getting rid of them, right? Because that technically is a way of putting them away.
No, so they're putting them away.
Yeah, putting them away, but
in a safe place.
Yes.
We're going to talk about this term that is bantied about quite a bit. A couple of terms that have become in vogue for reasons that we will discuss in the last couple of years would be this term and what other term?
Immutability.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think we need to start, though, before we dive into this topic, I think we need to start with the history because...
Yeah. Back in the day.
Yeah. Well, I don't think most folks understand the context. They're like, oh, they use the term, but they don't know like where it necessarily came from, right? And I think that becomes important.
This is one of those things where context really matters, right? So we have to go back to the days when everybody made tapes, right? That was just how backups were made. All backups were on tape, and that's just the way it was. And if you were doing it right, in my opinion, right, you always put a gap of air, between
like an actual physical
gap of air between your backups and the thing you were backing up. There were two ways to do that. One would be to send the original offsite. The other and more proper way to do it would be to make a copy and then send one of those offsite. I actually prefer that you send the original offsite.
So just a couple clarifications. When you talk about a physical gap, you're not just talking about like our good friends at OVH and how they had a fire, right? Where technically there was... That's why I'm asking, right? Is there was technically a gap of air between those systems?
Well, no, there wasn't.
There were different racks.
No. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
So if you're electronically connected to the thing, that is not air gapped.
Okay. That's why I'm asking for clarification.
Yeah, good point. What I'm talking about is an offline, very important, an offline, both in terms of electronically offline and physically offline copy, that there is like I said, literally a gap of air. There is no way to get to it electronically.
Yeah.
Right? The only way you could get to it was a person. You needed to call Iron Mountain or whoever you had, and you needed to bring it back. Yeah. And then what you could do, and you would do, is you would put all different levels of what we would now call IAM, right, between you and your data and that copy of your data, right? It wasn't even really possible, but you wouldn't have the concept of like using your same login to go get your tapes, right? You would go in, you would do it, you would have some sort of physical identification method. You would have an ID, you would have a process to authenticate yourself. And we're talking about actually physically showing up, going in, getting tapes, or you would have a protocol for contacting the people and having them bring it to you.
Yeah.
And if you deviated from that protocol, for example, if you called up and said, I don't want you to take my tapes to the bank where you always took them, I want you to take them and meet me at a Walmart.
Yeah.
That would be a problem.
Yeah.
Right. And obviously back then we weren't worried about like AI voices faking that stuff.
But this is kind of like, I would say, why it was needed from like an enterprise perspective. But I'm sure smaller companies, right, you could still achieve air gaps, if you will, without requiring like Iron Mountain or another service. I know we've brought up the case multiple times, right, with someone doing a backup and then shipping a tape in a box to a different facility and then just exchanging tapes back and forth. Or
for smaller companies, another thing that you would do is if you were, what I call a TSB, a truly small business, you might take the tape out and put it in your trunk and take it home.
Yeah.
Right. And then you got to just worry that you're not leaving the tape in a hot car and all of that kind of stuff. But the biggest thing that we were worried about back then was natural disasters and fires and floods and things like that.
Yeah.
So you wanted to physically separate that copy as much as possible from the thing that it was protecting. We weren't so much worried about cyber. It wasn't completely out of the question, but mainly what we were worried about was actually, besides the natural disasters and things, we actually were more worried about like social engineering, like the movie Sneakers, which if you haven't seen the movie Sneakers, please go watch the movie Sneakers. There's a few things in there that are obviously very silly and over the top, but honestly, some of the best depiction of social engineering I've ever seen, not to mention a lot of fun and a lot of stars.
Yeah.
Robert Redford, Dan Aykroyd, James Earl Jones, what's the actor that you now know to be Indian?
Ben Kingsley.
Ben Kingsley, yeah. Because we discussed, you thought for a long time he wasn't Indian because of that name. He's in it. Anyway, great movie. We were more concerned about that sort of thing. And so we would actually, and again, yes, this is for an enterprise, but we actually had a process where we would, on a regular basis, try to defeat the security. Right? We would go over there and we would have a very involved story as to why, for example, I needed to be left in the vault alone.
So you were red teaming
with my tapes, huh?
You were red teaming.
We were red teaming. Which is what Sneakers is about as well. Yeah. Please watch that movie. Just a good movie.
Is it a strict requirement that the copy be off-site for it to be air-gapped? Or would you consider a case where someone takes a backup and physically removes it from the tape drives, puts it on a shelf or in a safe in the location, or a tape robot as an example that removes...
Well, those are two very different things.
I know. I'm just... Yeah, I know, but I'm just trying to understand.
These are great questions. You're so good at asking these questions, Prasanna. So technically, no. The term air gap... Right?
Yeah.
In IT parlance, generally refers to a computer that isn't connected to the network, right? Then there's computers that are almost air gapped, right? where they're massively firewalled off from right?
Anything, yeah.
Yeah. I can think back to being at Amazon when I worked at Amazon. I had a contract there in 98, and they had a computer that was a payment processing computer, and it was basically one-way traffic. Yeah. So to go to your question, technically the term air gap could apply to a tape that has been taken out and is in a safe, in a safe place on premises. But that would just, if that's your only copy, that would violate what?
3-2-1 rule.
Yes, that would violate the 3-2-1 rule, right? 3 copies of data on 2 different media, one of which is off-site.
Yeah. So, okay, so that works for the first scenario I described.
But I mean, you also talked about a second scenario, which is a tape in a tape library that is accessible to the system air-gapped, and I'm going to say absolutely not.
Yeah.
Right? Because, why? Because I can electronically control that tape library. I can put that tape in the tape drive, and I can erase that tape.
Yep.
So that is not air-gapped.
Okay.
Even though there is technically...
That's why I was trying to determine what qualifies. Because I think as we talk about modern air gaps and how people have changed the words, I think it's good to understand the history.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that is the gold standard by which anything that wants to call itself air gap is measured. Back then, we were predominantly concerned with fires, floods, terrorist attacks, etc. And we still are concerned with those things. It's just that the likelihood of those is much less than the likelihood of something else, which would be
ransomware.
ransomware or any kind of a cyber attack. But yeah, ransomware, definitely.
I agree that cyber attacks make it difficult, but I wonder if that's sort of what do you say? That's just kind of like a secondary effect, right? But do you think that it's because having disconnected systems is nearly impossible these days?
Yeah, we'll get to that. I'm just saying that back then we were predominantly concerned with physical things that needed a physical separation. Now we're concerned primarily, while we're still concerned with those things, we've somewhat dealt with many of those things with a lot of technologies, a lot of replication, a lot of highly available systems, especially for mission critical systems. But we have not necessarily kept up with this relatively new threat, which is, the idea of a cyber attack and a ransomware attack. And there is also, so that's the new reason why air gap is even more important than it was before. What is the reason that backup systems don't really have air gaps as I defined them earlier?
Because they're connected, right? And typically these backup systems are no longer using tape, right?
Yeah.
You're now using things like deduplicated storage. You might be using the cloud, right? You have all these other options, and so you're not really using tape anymore. And also the new backup technologies that we talked about, like incremental forever, which tape isn't so friendly with.
No, they're not. Our previous episode, we talked about the concept of incremental forever and what a great thing it is, but it would not work very well. So, I want to make sure people understand me here. Like, I definitely am on the record of being a friend of tape, right? And tape has a lot of uses and it's got a lot of life left in it. Until someone invents something that offers everything that tape offers at the price point that tape offers it, tape will continue.
DNA.
There's a guy that Stored Zilla was his Twitter name. I don't know if it still is, but Mark Toomey, and he used to say that there'll be a nuclear apocalypse, and somewhere in the world there will be somebody with a mainframe and some tape, right? It's not going anywhere anytime soon. There's all sorts of possible other things that we're talking about to maybe supplant tape, but it's not going anywhere anytime soon. But it definitely is not. Let's go back to my concept. I'm definitely a friend of tape. Having said that, there are a lot of reasons why we moved off the tape for on-premises backup, right? There were a lot of really good reasons. I mean, there were downsides of tape, right? Specifically having to do with how fast tape was and how slow backup was, and it was a fundamental mismatch. And that's really the core reason why we moved off of tape. And then we got a lot of really cool things like incremental forever, the idea of being able to replicate backups. Yep. Now we can have an on-site backup and an off-site backup without touching a tape, without doing anything. It's just magic. And we have on-prem and off-prem. We can back up using deduplication. We can back up across the internet.
Yep.
Who would have thought, right? But
there are some drawbacks
already. The big drawback from a cybersecurity perspective is that there's no air gap.
Yep.
Not an air gap as defined
previously,
as we talked about in the beginning.
Yeah, and I think this is why many vendors have now sort of modified the term air gap to now call it a virtual air gap, a logical air gap, to basically nuance it versus our initial definition.
My experience has been they don't even nuance it. They just say air gap, and they only use those terms when pushed, right? And they'll just say it's air gapped, right? And they'll and I'm going to say no, it's not.
Yeah. So let's talk about what some vendors now call air gap, quote unquote, air quotes, right? But can we use the word virtual air gap just for the rest of this podcast, just to refer to this new definition that people are using.
Yeah. So basically, I would put it into like two categories. One is that if it's in a storage system that refers to itself as worm, right? That's write once, read many. In other words, a immutable storage system, meaning that the data cannot be deleted. And these are two different things. I want to definitely separate. There is storage that is damn near immutable.
Yep.
Right? Even tape that's immutable isn't really immutable.
Set fire to
it. You can take a hammer. What did you say? A what?
Set fire to it.
Yeah. Flamethrower, right?
Yeah.
Same thing with optical media and anything that claims to be immutable. Nothing is 100% immutable. But there are storage systems that even if you root it, basically, you can't overwrite the data.
Yep.
It's there. Now, having said that, again, you could set fire to it, right?
Yep.
Which is why when we start talking about cloud copy. So that's one way in which that.
And before you get to sort of the immutable, right, versus the other one, maybe we should talk about, like, if we kind of distill down what the air gap provided, right, or what they're looking for air gap to provide, right?
Sure.
It's really about making sure that the data doesn't go away when there is a cyber attack or something else like that.
Exactly. That's pretty much the whole reason of an air gap. And so how can we do that in an electronic world, in an online world, in a cloud world? How can we ensure that when the feces hits the rotary oscillator, that that you will have at least one copy that is somewhere that that is available to you.
And so this is a great technology that a lot of vendors offered, and it's been around for a long time. I want to say I first heard about this almost 2 decades ago.
The concept of immutable storage?
Yeah. Right. So it's been around for a while. It does offer some great capabilities, but also some drawbacks, right? I think the biggest being, if you write to it, if you ever want to delete it for whatever reason is needed, right? I accidentally wrote something I shouldn't have. I needed to reduce my retention periods for legal reasons, whatever it is. You can't delete it.
Sorry, not sorry on that one, right? And so, and when we talk about immutable, and we've done an episode or two on that, there are various levels of immutability, right? There are, basically append-only file systems. There are, but many of them have kind of a backdoor that then you need to look into what does it take to use that to get to the back door, and all of that different stuff. But the best ones are storage level immutable, so that even if you got super all powerful, then you wouldn't be able to.
The only way to delete the data is basically to physically break the hard drives.
Right. And so that's one thing. And then the other thing is basically IAM, right? So identity and access management. So we have a copy that's not technically immutable in the cloud, but it's just impossible to get to it, right? And the idea is that you use a different IAM system for this copy than you do for the rest of the world, and you also you basically put many levels of protection, right? Obviously, you have MFA, you have passkeys, you have all of the best security that you have available to you, and and you just follow all of the best practices to ensure as best as possible that even if somebody got a username and password, they wouldn't be able to do, you protect it as much as you can.
I agree with that. And I think another thing you can consider is this could either be something like when you said IAM, right, and putting access controls, right? Another mechanism is there are two ways I look at it. Either you do it yourself, so you're creating separate AWS accounts, you're putting it in, if you run primarily on Amazon, maybe you're backing up to Microsoft Azure or whatever else, right? So you're kind of segregating and isolating your environment. Another mechanism is maybe you end up using a cloud service provider, right? Or a SaaS service provider that actually provides these services for you and kind of gives you that separation that you need.
Yeah. Essentially, they have the key to the vault.
Yeah.
Right. And speaking of cloud service providers, I was thinking about with the first one, with Immutable, there are backup vendors, cloud backup vendors that, while the backups as they are writing it, they're not using immutable storage, because immutable storage and dedupe don't really go well together very well, at least in terms of the way cloud does the costing and everything. So they don't use immutable storage on the back end because there is immutable storage available in the cloud. They don't use that in the back end, but then what they do is they have software level immutable storage built into their product that basically says, even if you were a cloud admin of this particular backup product, you would not be able to, using the backup product, delete the data to basically prematurely expire your backups. Yeah. And then also built into the configuration is that there's, again, with the IAM, there's all these protections so that there's no way to get to the data in the cloud except through their application, and then they make the application, immutable, as I may call it. Exactly. So this is the way they make their virtual air gap.
So I wanted to ask you, so I agree with these two approaches for how you achieve protection against cyber attacks.
Yeah.
Right, which is what an air gap is supposed to provide, right? A virtual air gap. So we talked about controls. I know some vendors, they offer sort of a mechanism to create a secure vault for their backups. And these vendors, though, the mechanisms that they use is because they are using storage level replication,
right?
Is they actually do things like kill the network connection when not needed.
Right.
And have separate management domains between source and destination and the vault. Right. To give you that isolation. Yeah. So you're not always having this connected all the time.
Yeah.
And reducing the exposure.
Yeah, that's really good. I think this falls into basically a third category, which is a simulated air gap, right? Even more virtual than it's simulated in that they're doing their best, like you said, like shutting off the connection, so that at least when they're not actively replicating, that there is literally no connection to that device. Yeah, that is another topic. That is another method. Yeah, I like that.
I do wonder, so just since we're talking about that, I wonder how it is if you go through like Tor to then connect to your backup infrastructure, your vault, right? The onion router, if you will.
Yeah. Well, I know some companies you open up a Tor browser and you're fired, but I'm not a dark web guy, so and I think that's a good thing. but because of that, I have no opinion on that.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, but so regardless, though, I think it is important for people to understand when companies today talk about air gaps, 99.99% of the time, it's probably referring to virtual air gaps, where it's relying on something like immutability or IAM or network connectivity in order to provide some form of isolation. It may not be as perfect as what we had initially with tapes, but it still satisfies some of those use cases that are needed to handle cyber attacks.
Yeah. Yeah. So unless they're using the word tape, then yeah, it's gonna be virtual.
But it's even hard though, because as we talked about in one of the previous episodes, right, about tapes and is it dead, right? Hyperscalers are using tape. You don't know what they're like, what is actually being done, and so for you to figure out is something truly air gapped or not, may be even more difficult these days.
Yeah, it's the old phrase of on the internet, nobody knows if you're a dog. Nobody knows if you're a tape. But yeah, so hopefully that helps understand like what was an air gap, why was it there, and just when you're comparing, just don't any more than the term immutable. Don't just take a term and go, oh, it's air gapped, right? How is it air gapped? How is it air gapped? As I make air quotes.
Air quotes.
Air quoted air gap. Ask questions, understand what they're doing, and then unless they're making a copy and putting it on tape and then handing it to a man in a van, it's not really air gapped, at least in terms of not the OG.
Yeah. Well, and I think maybe that's the thing to think about too is, do you really need that level of protection?
Yes. I'm sorry.
Right? Or what are you looking to solve? And a lot of that comes down to what are the needs of your business and what is the impact from a cyber attack and how you're protecting yourself.
Exactly. All right. And on that note, I will say thank you once again, sir, for, first for, goading me to get my taxes done. And second, for doing another good episode of the...
I like air gaps. Yeah, it's definitely something that comes up, and I think I'm getting to that point in my career where when people misuse a phrase, it kind of irks me. I'm like, oh, it's not what it's for.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I'll just say this. It's because you're older, right? Even though you're not as old as me, you're still older than, these whippersnappers. And I had this image. I was at Lowe's yesterday and I was checking out. I was just checking, I was buying some screws.
Yeah.
And then I got in line, and there was this guy that was older than me, and they only had the self-checkout lines open. There was no actual checkout. He's like, can't even hire anybody to run the registers anymore. I'm like, oh my God, dude. Like, it made me laugh. Anyway, all right. Well, that is a wrap. The Backup Wrap-Up is written, recorded, and produced by me, W. Curtis Preston. If you need backup or DR consulting, content generation, or expert witness work, check out backupcentral.com. You can also find links for my O'Reilly books on the same website. Remember, this is an independent podcast, and any opinions that you hear are those of the speaker and not necessarily an employer. Thanks for listening.